Another view, I spoke to Representative Peter Roskam of Illinois. He's the Chief Deputy Republican Whip and a member of the House Ways and Means Committee. Congressman, thank you for joining us. You are the chief nose counter, vote counter in the House Republican caucus. Where does the Boehner plan stand tonight? Do you have those 217 votes?
I think there's very good momentum on the Boehner plan. I think what most members of Congress are recognizing is that there's a few options that they face. One is to default, which is a non-starter. It's a non-option. The other is to accept Senator Reid's plan, which is filled with gimmicks, with all due respect to Senator Reid. And the other pathway forward is the plan that Speaker Boehner laid out. And I think more and more members, the more they see in the plan, the more comfortable they are. And so we propose to move that within the next couple of days.
In your caucus meeting today, what did people express that worried them the most about this? Why isn't everyone automatically in favor of this?
Well, look, I think that there's a level of concern about the same sort of themes that we've been hearing throughout this entire debate, and that is that the cuts don't match where we are as a nation and that we can always go deeper, which is a premise that I completely accept. Now, the reality is that we're dealing with Harry Reid, who controls the United States Senate, and a president of the United States who has not authored his own plan and has even resisted a great deal of these cuts along the way. So what we're trying to do is make sure that we accomplish a couple key goals. Number one, make sure that the obligations of the federal government are met and that every obligation is taken care of. And secondly, to make sure that we're actually cutting more than we're raising the debt ceiling. Those are themes that we've been consistent with throughout. And within that framework, I think that there's been a great spirit of accommodation and trying to move forward.
Is there any across the aisle bipartisan conversation at all going on about this anymore?
Well, look, there's conversations, but they're largely conversations in passing, I think, at this point. Because the reality is I don't expect any House Democrats to vote for this. I think the reality is this is something that Speaker Boehner and Leader Reid negotiated together until President Obama voiced some objections to Leader Reid about this. So I think it's been happening at the level of Leader Reid, Speaker Boehner, and now Speaker Boehner is planning to move it through the House with the support of his conference.
We have heard today that the phones were jammed at the Capitol with people calling in, your constituents calling in and saying, why can't you get this done? Is that what you're hearing from your members as well?
I think that there's a high level of expectation on the part of the American public that their leaders come together and solve two things. One is make sure the obligations are met and that we don't go into any sort of tailspin as a result of this. But as importantly, make sure that the debt ceiling isn't raised just willy-nilly with no preconditions. And I think if there's a thoughtful way forward, and that I would submit is the Boehner plan that accomplishes those two things, I think most Americans can get their heads around that and feel a high level of confidence, which is why I think it's interesting when you were interviewing the White House representative, he very carefully didn't say that the president would veto the bill. And I think they've obviously left the door open because they know this bill is going to end up on President Obama's desk.
But they did say the two-step plan, the voting now and voting later plan, would be difficult for the economy.
Well, look, I think there's all kinds of difficulties for the economy. Even worse and more difficult for the economy was the premise that President Obama came to the Congress with months ago, and that was simply raise the debt ceiling, give an additional $2.4 trillion with no preconditions. So there's a great deal of concern as we move forward with any economic growth, and I think the 9.2% unemployment figure is actually a body blow to the whole American economy. So we've all got our work cut out for us, but for the administration to lay at the feet of this debt ceiling conversation all the economic woes, I think is an overstatement.
Let me read to you something that Speaker Boehner said today in a radio interview as we talk about this compromise issue or this coming to some sort of agreement issue. He said Barack Obama, speaking of his own plan, Barack Obama hates it, Harry Reid hates it, Nancy Pelosi hates it. Now, why would Republicans want to be on the side of Barack Obama, Harry Reid, and Nancy Pelosi? That's beyond me, he said. Where do you see a solution with that kind of rhetoric?
Well, was he referring, because I don't see the quote, was he referring to
his own plan?
To John Boehner's plan? Well, ultimately, that's, I think, a clue to the pathway forward. And I think what most...
How's that?
Well, I think it's representative of the idea that what is it in this plan that President Obama objects to? He objects to the spending restraint in the plan and ultimately the inability to move forward and do the types of spending that he's proposed in the past. Now we're down to this witching hour. It is upon us. And I think what has to happen is cooler heads have to prevail. We've got to come together around a plan. The Boehner plan is the only one that can get to the president's desk. We need to get this done, and the president needs to sign it.
What path do you see to this getting to the White House, to the president's desk, if the Senate, as they say now, have no intention of endorsing and supporting the Boehner plan?
I think two things. First is this is something that Leader Reid did negotiate with Speaker Boehner, and to know John Boehner is to know that he's not a person that overstates positions. So clearly in that negotiation, Leader Reid disclosed where the majority was in the United States Senate. That's the first thing. The second thing is we've heard a lot of bluster out of the United States Senate over the past couple of weeks. We heard the Senate admonish the House that it was going to be working till this all went to fruition, and ultimately the Senate adjourned last weekend. So I think when it all comes down to it and we're faced with paying our bills and meeting our obligations, the Senate will step up, do the right thing, pass this, and the president will sign it.
Wall Street Journal editorial page, which usually sides with you on these things, wrote today that they basically think that Republican lawmakers may be seeking the perfect over the good in opposing the Boehner plan. Is that the way you see it?
Well, I think I've been involved in a lot of conversations, even within the past few hours, with some Republican lawmakers who are reluctant about the Boehner plan to begin with. And to that point, they've recognized that the perfect is the enemy of the good. And we've had members that have been very eloquent on that point. And so now what they're trying to do is to move forward with two simple concepts. One is meet the obligations of the federal government, and number two, raising the debt ceiling.
How much of this is about getting to that, and how much of this is about ultimately forcing the president to choose?
Well, I don't think people are laying awake at night trying to opine and come up with schemes about making the president choose. Ultimately, what's bringing everybody together on all of these votes is the notion that August 2nd is a date of consequence that has to be dealt with. So I wouldn't submit that there is any, political posturing and other nonsense. I think that there's a lot of folks that are looking for a pathway forward, and that's where I think John Boehner is trying to lead, and I think ultimately that will be a successful effort.
Peter Roskam, Republican from Illinois, thank you so much.
Thanks, Gwen.